A millionaire is enjoying his morning coffee in the elegant office of his company when he suddenly feels a sharp pain in his chest that rapidly intensifies. At this critical moment, the 7-year-old daughter of the cleaning lady, who had been playing in the hallway, runs desperately to him shouting, "Sir, the secretary put something in your coffee." Before he can even process this shocking revelation, he collapses on the office floor, sending everyone into a panic. When doctors later discover a toxic substance in his system, the investigation uncovers something much bigger than anyone ever imagined. Monday began like any other for Eduardo Sterling, but fate had something different planned for the 52-year-old man who had built a business empire with his own hands. The clock showed 7:15 in the morning when he walked through the glass doors of his office on the 40th floor, breathing in the familiar aroma of Italian leather from the armchairs he had personally chosen years ago. Marcia Davies, his secretary of 8 years, was already at her desk with a smile he knew well. A 43-year-old woman, always impeccable, always anticipating his needs before he even voiced them. It was this efficiency that made her indispensable in his obsessive work routine. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Your coffee is ready as always," she said, rising with the white porcelain cup he immediately recognized. It was his favorite, a gift he had received from his late wife years ago. Eduardo nodded, absorbed in the documents he needed to review before the 9 o'clock meeting. That morning was crucial for the future of Sterling Corporation. The contracts spread across his desk represented the biggest deal of his career, a merger that would transform his regional company into a national powerhouse. "You seem tense today," Marcia observed, placing the cup on the noble wooden coaster. "This meeting is really important, isn't it?" "It's what will define the next 10 years of the company," Eduardo replied, lifting his eyes from the papers. "Has Rodrigo arrived early today?" Rodrigo Maxwell, his partner of 15 years, was the only one he trusted completely to share major decisions. Together, they had transformed a small family construction business into a respected conglomerate in the real estate sector. "He's in the conference room, reviewing the presentations," Marcia informed, tidying some papers on the desk. "He said he wanted to make sure everything was perfect." Eduardo smiled, grateful to have such dedicated people by his side. He picked up the cup and inhaled the rich aroma of the premium coffee that Marcia always prepared with special care. It was a morning ritual that calmed him, a moment of pause before the storm of decisions each day brought. In the hallway, tiny footsteps echoed discreetly. Isabella, the 7-year-old daughter of Brenda Miller, the cleaner, was quietly playing with her doll while her mother finished cleaning the neighboring offices. The girl had a habit of observing everything with her large, curious eyes, absorbing every detail of the adult world around her. Eduardo brought the cup to his lips and took the first sip. The taste was slightly different today, but he attributed it to the tension he felt. Big deals always altered his palate, a reaction he knew well after decades of building his fortune. "Marcia, could you bring the financial reports from the last quarter? I want to make sure all the numbers are updated," he requested, taking another sip of coffee. "Of course, sir. I was already preparing everything," she replied, heading to the filing cabinet with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Eduardo returned his attention to the contracts, but something felt different. His heart began to race, not from the usual anxiety of big business, but from a strange physical sensation he couldn't identify. He thought it was just the caffeine, but the feeling intensified. From the hallway, Isabella watched through the half-open door. Her childish eyes had caught something the adults hadn't noticed. She had seen Marcia do something strange with Uncle Eduardo's coffee, as she affectionately called him. The businessman took another sip, trying to focus on the numbers before him, but a sharp pain shot through his chest like a cold blade. The pain in Eduardo's chest intensified rapidly, radiating to his left arm like liquid fire coursing through his veins. He dropped the cup, which shattered on the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silent office. The dark coffee spread like a sinister stain, contrasting with the immaculate white of the floor. "Mr. Sterling!" Marcia exclaimed, rushing towards him with a look of surprise that seemed genuine. "What's happening?" Eduardo tried to respond, but the words were lost in his throat. His vision began to blur, and he clung to the edge of the executive desk, trying to stay on his feet. The important documents he had carefully reviewed scattered across the floor, mixing with the porcelain shards. It was then that a sharp cry cut through the morning air of the office. "Uncle, the secretary put something in your coffee!" Isabella's voice echoed down the hall as she ran towards the office, her small legs moving as fast as she could. The girl burst through the door, her brown eyes shining with tears and determination. Brenda appeared right behind her, still holding her cleaning cloth, her face pale with fright at the scene before her. "Isabella, don't talk nonsense," Marcia reprimanded, with a trembling voice, but the girl was not intimidated. I saw her put a little white powder in the cup while she stirred the coffee." Isabella pointed at Marcia with her small hand, her voice firm despite her fear. "Uncle is feeling sick because of it." Eduardo looked at the child through the fog that was beginning to envelop his consciousness. There was something in the sincerity of those childish eyes that pierced the growing confusion in his mind. He tried to speak, but could only murmur unintelligible words. "Call an ambulance!" Brenda shouted, dropping her cleaning supplies and running to help Eduardo, who was beginning to stagger dangerously. Marcia hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal, her eyes darting between Eduardo and Isabella. "Yes, of course, I'm calling now," she finally said, picking up the phone with visibly trembling hands. Eduardo felt his legs give way. The world spun around him, and he collapsed onto the office floor, the impact softened by the Persian rug that adorned the room. Brenda knelt beside him, checking his pulse with the experience of someone who had cared for sick family members. "His heart is racing," she murmured, looking worriedly at Marcia. "What kind of health problems does he have?" "He never had any heart issues," Marcia replied quickly. "Always very healthy. It must be stress from the important meeting." Isabella didn't take her eyes off Marcia, her childish mind processing details that the adults seemed to ignore. She had learned from her mother to observe everything around her, a skill she had developed during her quiet hours in the company's hallways. "Mommy, she's lying," Isabella whispered in Brenda's ear. "I saw her take a small packet from her purse and pour it into the coffee when she thought no one was looking." Brenda felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew her daughter well enough to know that she wouldn't invent something so serious. The girl had always been observant and honest, characteristics that sometimes got her into trouble for speaking inconvenient truths. The sound of ambulance sirens began to echo in the distance, gradually growing louder. Eduardo struggled to maintain consciousness, his mind trying to process the girl's words through the thickening fog in his thoughts. Rodrigo appeared at the office door, drawn by the commotion. "What happened here?" he asked, looking at the scene. With genuine astonishment. "Mr. Sterling suddenly fell ill," Marcia explained. "I think it was a heart attack." "It wasn't a heart attack," Isabella insisted, her voice small but determined. "It was something she put in his coffee." Rodrigo looked at the girl with curiosity, then at the unconscious Eduardo on the floor. Something in Marcia's expression made him frown, but the paramedics arrived before he could question more deeply. The paramedics burst into the office with military efficiency, their voices echoing technical commands as they quickly assessed Eduardo's condition. The team leader, an experienced man with graying hair, knelt beside the unconscious businessman and checked his vital signs with precise movements. "Extremely low blood pressure," Irregular and rapid pulse, he announced to his team. We'll need to monitor him during transport. Brenda stepped back to make room for the professionals, but kept Isabella close to her. The girl watched everything with wide eyes, absorbing every detail of the chaotic situation unfolding before her. Did he take any medication today? The paramedic asked, looking at the people present. Not that I know of, Marcia replied quickly. He never takes medicine. He's always been very healthy. And no family history of heart problems. Never mentioned anything of the sort, Marcia insisted. But Isabella tugged at her mother's skirt with insistence. Mommy, tell them about the powder, the girl whispered, loud enough for others to hear. The paramedic looked up, interested. What powder? Brenda hesitated, looking nervously at Marcia before replying. My daughter said she saw someone put something in his coffee. That's absurd, Marcia protested, her voice rising an octave. The girl must have been confused. Children? Imagine a lot. Rodrigo, who had been silently observing the scene, approached the paramedic. Would it be possible that he was poisoned? The word poisoned hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The paramedic exchanged significant glances with his team before responding. It's a possibility we cannot rule out. We'll collect samples of what's left in the cup and inform the hospital to perform full toxicological exams. Marcia visibly paled, her hands trembling as she watched the paramedics collect the porcelain shards and spilled coffee in small, sterile containers. Every movement seemed like a silent condemnation. I need to go with him, Rodrigo declared, picking up his jacket. We've been partners for 15 years. He has no other close family. I'll go too, Brenda said impulsively, surprising everyone. I mean, if someone's needed to testify about what my daughter saw... Marcia stepped forward. There's no need to bother you. I can accompany him. After all, I'm his secretary and know all his medical procedures. No! Isabella exclaimed, clinging to her mother. She can't go. She's the one who hurt Uncle. The silence that followed was awkward. All eyes turned to the girl, then to Marcia, who struggled to maintain her composure. That's a very serious accusation coming from a child, the paramedic said carefully. Perhaps it's best if all of you go to the hospital. The police will likely want to speak with the witnesses. The word police made Marcia involuntarily take a step back. Rodrigo noticed the movement and frowned, a suspicion beginning to form in his mind. Eduardo was gently placed on the stretcher, the monitoring equipment beeping constantly as the team headed for the elevator. His face was pale as marble, contrasting with the dark suit he wore. Mommy, will Uncle be okay? Isabella asked, her small voice laden with concern. I hope so, my dear, Brenda replied, squeezing the girl's hand. You were very brave to speak up. Rodrigo overheard the conversation and approached them. Isabella, are you sure about what you saw? The girl looked at him with a seriousness beyond her years. Yes, Uncle Rodrigo. She took a small packet from her purse and poured it into the coffee when she thought no one was looking. But I was playing in the hallway and saw everything. The pieces of a sinister puzzle began to form in Rodrigo's mind. He watched Marcia, who avoided his gaze as she gathered her purse with trembling hands. The elevator arrived, and they all entered in tense silence. Eduardo unconscious among them, oblivious to the storm his condition was about to unleash. Metro General Hospital. Buzzed with activity when the ambulance arrived with Eduardo, Brenda held Isabella's hand tightly as they watched the doctors disappear with the stretcher through the automatic doors of the emergency room. Rodrigo paced back and forth in the waiting area, his cell phone glued to his ear, cancelling important appointments. Marcia remained seated in a corner, pretending to check messages on her phone, but her nervous eyes darted between the ICU door and the hallway from which the police might emerge at any moment. Every second that passed seemed like an eternity, filled with guilt and fear. "Family of Eduardo Sterling?" The doctor's voice echoed through the waiting room after 2 long hours. Rodrigo immediately approached. "I'm his partner. How is he, doctor?" Dr. Henry Thompson, an experienced middle-aged cardiologist, consulted his clipboard before replying. "His condition is stable for now, but we found something concerning in the preliminary tests." "What exactly?" Rodrigo asked, feeling his stomach clench. "There are signs of intoxication in his blood. We detected a combination of substances that are not natural to the human body." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of medical equipment in the background. Brenda instinctively pulled Isabella closer, as if to shield her from the implications of those words. "What kind of substances?" Rodrigo insisted. "A potent sedative mixed with something that causes cardiac arrhythmias. The combination is especially dangerous because it can simulate a natural heart attack, but the effects are much more severe." Marcia visibly tensed upon hearing the medical explanation. Her hands began to tremble again, and she tried to disguise it by drinking water from a plastic cup. "Does that mean someone tried to—" Rodrigo couldn't finish the sentence. "Tried to harm him deliberately, yes," the doctor confirmed. "We've already alerted the police, as per hospital protocol, for cases of possible poisoning." Isabella looked at her mother with eyes that said, "I wasn't lying." But Brenda just hugged her tighter, feeling the weight of the responsibility that fell upon them as the only eyewitnesses. "Doctor, the girl here saw someone put something in his coffee this morning," Rodrigo said, pointing discreetly to Isabella. Dr. Thompson knelt down to the child's height. "Can you tell me what you saw, little one?" Isabella looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I was playing in the hallway when I saw his secretary take a small packet from her purse and pour it into the coffee. She stirred it really well, so the powder would disappear." "And are you sure it was the secretary?" the doctor asked gently. "Yes, I am. She's the lady who always wears nice clothes and sits at the big desk near Uncle Eduardo's office." All eyes turned to Marcia, who tried to maintain her composure but was clearly shaken. "That's absurd. A child cannot make such serious accusations." "Actually, she can," a firm voice interrupted the discussion. Detective Carlos Miller had arrived, accompanied by 2 investigators. "Eyewitnesses are fundamental in cases like this, regardless of age." Marcia felt her blood run cold. What had started as a seemingly perfect plan was rapidly crumbling before her eyes. "We'll need to speak with all of you separately," the detective continued. "This is now officially a case of attempted homicide." The word homicide echoed through the waiting room like a gunshot. Brenda instinctively hugged Isabella tighter, while Rodrigo processed the gravity of the situation. "How long will it take for Mr. Sterling to recover?" Brenda asked the doctor. "If there are no complications, a few weeks, but the psychological effects of such a close betrayal can last much longer." Marcia closed her eyes, knowing there was no turning back. The plan that was supposed to seem like a natural accident had become a complex criminal investigation, and a 7-year-old girl had become her biggest threat. The interrogation room at the precinct was small and impersonal, with grey walls that seemed to absorb any trace of hope. Marcia sat across from Detective Miller, her hands clasped on the cold metal table, struggling to maintain an appearance of innocence while cold sweat ran down her forehead. Marcia Davies, 43 years old, executive secretary for 8 years, the detective read from her file. "No criminal record. Exemplary employee according to company records. I would never harm Mr. Sterling," she murmured, avoiding the investigator's penetrating gaze. "He has always been a fair boss to me." "Then how do you explain the girl's testimony? She was very specific about what she saw." Marcia took a deep, breath, trying to find a plausible explanation. Children have vivid imaginations. Maybe she saw me sweetening the coffee and misinterpreted. Was his coffee always sweetened? No, he preferred it black. But sometimes, Marcia realized her mistake the moment the words left her mouth. The detective raised an eyebrow. Sometimes what, Marcia? In another room, Brenda held Isabella's hand while a child psychologist gently and carefully conducted the girl's statement. Isabella, can you draw what you saw this morning? The psychologist asked, offering paper and colored pencils. The girl began to draw with concentration, creating simple but detailed figures. A woman with her hair tied back, pouring something from a small packet into a cup. The childish strokes were naive, but the sequence of events was clear. And are you sure it was Uncle Eduardo's secretary? Yes, she always wears clothes just like my fancy doll, Isabella replied, showing a small doll dressed in a business suit similar to what Marcia wore. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was being questioned in a third room. His position as a partner placed him under automatic suspicion in cases of corporate crimes. Rodrigo Maxwell, would you have any reason to wish ill upon your partner? The investigator responsible for his statement asked. Absolutely not, he replied firmly. Eduardo is my best friend of 15 years. We built this company together from the ground up. And what about business? Any recent disagreements? Rodrigo hesitated for a moment, remembering some discussions about the company's expansion. We had some differences over growth strategies, but nothing that would justify something like this. What kind of differences? Eduardo wanted to grow slower, more cautiously. I thought we should seize market opportunities more aggressively. The investigator carefully noted every word. In poisoning cases, financial motives were always thoroughly investigated. Back at the hospital, Eduardo had regained consciousness, but was still weak and confused. The nurses informed him about the events of the last few hours, and he struggled to process the information that someone had tried to poison him. Conceição's daughter said Marcia did this, he asked in a hoarse voice to a nurse. Yes, sir, the girl was very brave to speak up. Eduardo closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct the morning's events. He vaguely remembered the strange taste of the coffee, but had attributed it to the tension of the important meeting. The betrayal by someone he trusted completely was more painful than any poison. At the precinct, the preliminary results of the toxicological tests arrived by fax. The detective studied the papers with a grave expression before returning to the room where Marcia was waiting. The tests confirmed the presence of diazepam and digitalis in the victim's blood, he announced, observing her reaction. A lethal combination if it hadn't been discovered in time. Marcia's face lost any trace of color. Digitalis was a plant-derived compound she knew well, as her mother took heart medication containing this substance. Marcia, last chance to tell the truth. The detective leaned forward. Why did you try to kill Eduardo Sterling? The tears finally welled up in her eyes, and she knew there was no escape from the net closing around her. Marcia's tears fell like rain onto the cold interrogation room table. Her defenses had completely crumbled before the irrefutable evidence, and now she faced the reality of her actions. The detective waited patiently, knowing that moments like this often revealed deeper truths. I didn't want to hurt him, she whispered between sobs. It was never my intention for it to go this far. Then why did you do it, Marcia? The detective asked in a softer voice, changing his approach when he realized the pressure had broken her resistance. My mother is dying. The words came out in a whisper laden with pain. She needs experimental treatment that costs $300,000. I had no way to pay for it. The detective noted carefully but continued to probe. And how would poisoning your boss solve that? Marcia hesitated, looking at her own hands, as if searching for courage. It wasn't my idea. Someone approached me and said that if I did this, my mother would receive the treatment she needed. Who approached you? I can't say. He said, if I talked, my mother would die without the treatment. The detective leaned forward, understanding that there were deeper layers to this conspiracy. Marcia, do you realize you're being used? Whoever this person is, they manipulated you by taking advantage of your desperation. At the hospital, Eduardo received a visit from Brenda and Isabella. The girl had insisted on seeing him to make sure he was okay. Her small hands held a drawing she had made especially for him. Thank you for saving me, little hero, Eduardo said in a still weak voice but full of sincere gratitude. I couldn't let anyone hurt Uncle, Isabella replied with the seriousness of someone who had witnessed something terrible. Mommy always taught me that we have to protect good people. Brenda felt both pride and concern. Mr. Sterling, I hope you don't blame Marcia completely. She always seemed like a good person. Eduardo reflected on those words. Even after the betrayal, his generous nature prevented him from feeling only anger. Brenda, do you think she would do this alone? I don't know, sir, but I know desperation when I see it. Perhaps someone took advantage of some difficulty she was having. This observation planted a seed of doubt in Eduardo's mind. Marcia had always been loyal and dedicated. What could have driven her to such an extreme? At the company, Rodrigo had temporarily assumed Eduardo's responsibilities, cancelling the important meeting and explaining to investors that there had been a health issue that would be resolved soon. He didn't mention the poisoning to avoid panic among employees and business partners. While organizing papers in Eduardo's office, Rodrigo noticed something strange. Some important documents seemed to have been tampered with recently, and there were marks indicating someone had accessed the computer outside normal hours. This is strange, he murmured to himself, checking the access logs. Who would be here? After 10 at night last week, he decided to check the security cameras, but discovered something disturbing. The backup files for the last 2 weeks had been deleted, and the main system had failed precisely during the period when the coffee was prepared. This is no coincidence, he concluded, feeling a chill down his spine. Someone planned this carefully. Back at the precinct, Marcia finally succumbed to the moral pressure of her own conscience. It was Rodrigo, she said, in an almost inaudible voice. He approached me 3 weeks ago. He said he knew about my mother's situation and could help. The detective felt as if a bomb had exploded in the room. Rodrigo Maxwell, the victim's partner. He said that Eduardo was making decisions that would ruin the company, that if he were temporarily incapacitated, it would be better for everyone. He promised it would only be something to make him sick for a few days. And you believed that? I was desperate. My mother is dying, and he offered hope when I had none. The puzzle began to form a much more sinister picture. The detective understood that Marcia was just a pawn in a much more complex and dangerous game. Marcia's revelation hit the investigation like a hurricane. Detective Miller immediately dispatched a team to locate Rodrigo, but when they arrived at the company, they found he had left abruptly after an urgent call. His desk was too organized, as if it had been intentionally cleaned. He knew she talked, the detective muttered to his partner. Men like Rodrigo always have escape plans. At the hospital, Eduardo received the news of his best friend's betrayal. With a silence that was more eloquent than any scream, Brenda observed the pain settling in his eyes, a wound much deeper than any poison could cause. 15 years, he whispered, looking at the ceiling of the room. 15 years of friendship, trust, shared dreams. Mr. Sterling, Brenda said gently, Sometimes the people we love most are capable of the worst betrayals, but that doesn't mean you were wrong to trust. Isabella, who had been quietly playing with her doll, looked up. Uncle Eduardo, the man who always comes here in a nice suit, was your friend. He was. Little. One, or at least I thought he was. My grandma always said true friends protect us, not hurt us, Isabella said, with the simple wisdom of children. So he was never your real friend. Eduardo smiled for the first time since the poisoning. Isabella's childish clarity cut through, his emotional confusion like a sharp blade of truth. Meanwhile, Rodrigo was in his penthouse apartment, destroying documents and transferring money to offshore accounts. He had underestimated Marcia's ability to withstand pressure, and now he needed to accelerate his plans. His phone rang. It was a number he recognized immediately. His international contacts. "The situation is compromised," he said upon answering. "I need to accelerate the transfer of assets. How many days do you have?" asked the voice on the other end. "Maybe a few hours before they freeze my accounts." The plan was to have weeks to make this seem natural. Rodrigo looked out the panoramic window of his apartment, seeing the city he had helped build through business with Eduardo. Ironically, his greed had destroyed exactly what he so desperately wanted to possess. At the precinct, investigators discovered a complex network of suspicious financial transfers. Rodrigo had been diverting funds from the company for months, using Eduardo's trust to access important accounts and contracts. He wasn't just trying to temporarily incapacitate Eduardo, the forensic accountant explained. He was preparing a complete hostile takeover of the company. The poisoning was meant to look like a natural health issue that would force him to step away from the business. The detective studied the documents with growing indignation, and if Eduardo died, even better for his plans. As the sole surviving partner, he would automatically inherit everything. The calculated coldness of the plan shocked even experienced investigators. Rodrigo had turned 15 years of friendship into a tool for murder and theft. Eduardo received this information through a call from the detective. His voice remained surprisingly calm as he processed the extent of the betrayal. "Detective, does he still have access to the company accounts? We're working to freeze everything, but he's clever. He might have managed to transfer significant amounts." "What about the employees, the ongoing projects?" Even betrayed and poisoned, Eduardo's first concern was for the people who depended on the company. Brenda observed this display of character and understood why Isabella had grown so attached to him. "Mr. Sterling," she said after he hung up, "will you be able to save the company?" "I don't know, Brenda," he replied honestly, "but I know I'll try. Many families depend on these jobs." Isabella stood up from the chair where she was playing. "Uncle Eduardo, do you need help catching the bad man?" Eduardo smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Why, little detective? Do you have an idea?" "Maybe," she said with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I'm very good at observing things adults don't see." 3 days had passed since the revelation about Rodrigo, and Eduardo had finally been discharged from the hospital. Despite his physical weakness, his determination to protect the company and its employees drove him forward. Brenda had offered to help him during his recovery, and Isabella had become his constant companion, observing everything with her curious eyes. "Uncle Eduardo," Isabella said as he reviewed documents at home, "I remember more things about the man in the nice suit." Eduardo looked up from the papers. In recent days, he had learned to take the girl's observations very seriously. "What do you remember, little one?" He always talked on the phone secretly. "Once I heard him saying that you were too naive, and that soon he would be the boss of everything." Isabella's words confirmed Eduardo's suspicions about how long Rodrigo had been planning the betrayal. "When was that?" A long time ago, before last Christmas, he was in the small room that has a round table. Eduardo knew the room. It was where they held confidential meetings. The idea that Rodrigo had been planning his destruction for months, perhaps years, was like a dagger to his heart. Brenda entered the room carrying a tray with tea. "Mr. Sterling, some men in suits have arrived wanting to speak with you. They said they are lawyers." "Send them in," Eduardo said, but Isabella interrupted him. "Uncle, one of them is the same man who used to visit the man in the nice suit secretly." Eduardo and Brenda exchanged alarmed glances. "Are you sure, Isabella?" "Yes, I am. He has a strange mark on his forehead, like a small moon. I always noticed when they talked quietly in the hallway." Eduardo asked Brenda to receive the lawyers in the living room, while he and Isabella observed discreetly. The girl was right. One of the men had a crescent-shaped scar on his forehead. "They're not real lawyers," Eduardo whispered. "They're Rodrigo's accomplices." The fake lawyers presented documents alleging that Eduardo, due to recent health issues, should temporarily transfer control of the company to a qualified administrator, who coincidentally was Rodrigo. "My health is perfect," Eduardo said firmly, "and these documents are fake." "Mr. Sterling, we have medical reports indicating post-traumatic mental instability," the man with the scar insisted. Isabella, hidden behind the armchair, whispered to her mother, "Mommy, they're lying." "Uncle, Eduardo is fine." Eduardo realized that Rodrigo was using every possible resource to seize control of the company before the police captured him. It was a race against time. "Gentlemen, I'll need my own lawyers to analyze these documents," Eduardo said diplomatically. After the men left, he immediately called the detective. "They're escalating the pressure. Rodrigo must be desperate. We're monitoring all his accounts, but he's clever. He might have hidden money in tax havens months ago." Eduardo hung up and looked at Isabella, who was quietly playing with her doll, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "Isabella, you're a very good detective," he said. "Can you remember anything else strange you saw at the company?" Dane. Girl stopped playing and frowned, concentrating. "The man in the nice suit had a secret drawer in his desk. Once I saw him taking papers from there when he thought no one was looking." "Secret drawer?" "Yes, a false drawer under the desk. My doll fell near there once, and when I went to get it, I saw him pressing something that made the drawer appear." Eduardo felt a wave of hope. If Rodrigo kept secret documents at the company, perhaps there would be enough evidence to definitively incriminate him. "Isabella, would you be brave enough to show us this drawer?" The girl nodded with determination. "Of course, Uncle Eduardo. Let's catch the bad man." Brenda intervened with maternal concern. "Mr. Sterling, I don't want my daughter in danger. I will protect both of you with my life," Eduardo solemnly promised. "But we need this evidence before Rodrigo destroys everything and flees the country." Sterling Corporation was in sepulchral silence when Eduardo, Brenda, and Isabella arrived on Sunday evening. Eduardo had coordinated with the detective for the search to be done discreetly, avoiding alerting potential accomplices of Rodrigo who might still be among the employees. "It's very dark in here," Isabella whispered, holding her mother's hand, tightly as they walked through the familiar hallways that seemed different in the dim light. "It's just until we get to Rodrigo's office," Eduardo reassured, guiding them with a flashlight. "We can't turn on the main lights to avoid attracting attention." Detective Miller and 2 investigators awaited them in Rodrigo's office. The executive desk, once organized and imposing, now looked sinister under the light of the police flashlights. "Isabella, can you show us where this secret drawer is?" the detective asked gently. The girl nodded and approached the desk, running, her small hands over the polished wooden surface. "It was down here," she said, kneeling and feeling the underside of the desk. He would press something, and a drawer would appear. The investigators joined her, carefully examining every inch of the furniture. After a few minutes of searching, one of them found a small disguised mechanism. "Here it is," he announced, pressing an almost invisible button. A drawer slid silently out, revealing a collection of documents and electronic devices. Eduardo approached, immediately recognizing some of the papers. "These are contracts he told me were cancelled," he murmured, flipping through the documents with growing indignation. "And this looks like a digital recorder," the investigator said, holding up a small device. "Let's see what's on it." When they played the content, Rodrigo's voice echoed through the silent office. "Eduardo is too naive for modern business. When I take full control, this company will finally reach its true potential." Brenda instinctively pulled Isabella closer as she listened to the coldness in the voice of the man who had pretended to be a loyal friend for so many years. "There's more," the investigator continued, fast-forwarding the recording. "Marcia, you need to understand that this is for the good of everyone. Eduardo is making decisions that will bankrupt the company. If he's just out for a few days, I can correct his mistakes." "But what if something goes wrong?" Marcia's trembling voice responded on the recording. "Nothing will go wrong. It's just to make him sick for a few days. Your mother will get the treatment and the company will be saved." Eduardo closed his eyes, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Rodrigo had documented his own betrayal, probably as insurance in case he needed to blackmail Martia later. "There's more stuff here," said another investigator, pulling a folder from the drawer. "Fake contracts, predated property transfer documents, and this is interesting." He held up a sealed envelope with Eduardo's name on it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Eduardo," the detective read aloud, "if you are reading this, it means something went wrong with my plans. I want you to know it was never personal. You simply don't have the vision necessary to take this company to the next level. Consider this an early retirement." The cynicism of the letter shocked everyone present. Rodrigo had planned every detail, including a justification for himself in case he was discovered. Isabella, who had been quietly observing, the adults finally spoke. "Uncle Eduardo, the bad man won't be able to hurt anyone anymore, will he?" "No, little hero," Eduardo replied, kneeling down to her height. "Thanks to your courage, he'll never be able to harm anyone again." The detective carefully put away all the evidence. "With this, we have enough material to convict Rodrigo for attempted murder, corporate fraud, and a dozen other crimes. Now we just need to find him," Eduardo murmured. "Actually," Isabella said with a mischievous smile, "I think I know where he might be." Everyone turned to the girl in surprise. "Where, Isabella?" "He always talked about a beach house where he'd think about business. Once I heard him saying on the phone that it was his escape plan if things got bad." Eduardo smiled for the first time in days. His little detective had made a crucial discovery again. Isabella's information about the beach house led the police to a luxurious property in the Hamptons, 3 hours' drive from New York City. Detective Miller coordinated the operation carefully, knowing that Rodrigo might be armed or have accomplices protecting him. Eduardo had insisted on accompanying the operation, despite protests about his safety. "He was my best friend for 15 years, he argued. "Perhaps I can convince him to surrender without violence." Brenda and Isabella stayed safely at the precinct, but the girl had made the detective promise that he would tell her all the details of the capture. "I want to know if the bad man really goes to jail," she said with her characteristic seriousness. The beach house was an impressive retreat with panoramic ocean views. But what most caught the investigators' attention were the obvious signs of haste: open suitcases, scattered papers, and a computer still on, showing international bank transfers. "He was here until recently," the lead investigator whispered. "The fireplace ashes are still warm." Eduardo observed the scene with a mix of sadness and determination. He knew that house. Rodrigo had invited him several times to spend weekends there, always talking about how important it was to have a place to recharge. On the computer screen, Eduardo could see the true extent of the betrayal. Rodrigo had diverted over $2 million from the company over the last 6 months, transferring the money to offshore accounts. "My God," Eduardo murmured. "He stole enough to break the company." The sound of a boat engine echoed from the beach. Through the panoramic window, they could see a luxury yacht rapidly pulling away from the coast. "He's fleeing," now one of the investigators shouted. The detective immediately alerted the Coast Guard, but Rodrigo had a time advantage. His escape had been meticulously planned, including a maritime escape route. Eduardo looked out the window, watching the yacht become a distant speck on the horizon. A feeling of powerlessness momentarily overwhelmed him, but then he remembered Isabella's courageous words about never giving up on doing what is right. "Detective," Eduardo said, picking up his phone. "He can't have gone far." Rodrigo was always meticulous. He must have a specific plan. Eduardo called the local marina administrator, someone he had known for years through business. "Carlos, it's Eduardo Sterling. I need to know if Rodrigo Maxwell rented any vessel recently." "Rodrigo? Yes, he rented a luxury yacht 2 weeks ago. Said he was going on a business trip to the Caribbean." "Is the yacht still there?" "No, he left early this morning, but Eduardo, there's something strange." "What?" "He paid for a whole month in advance, but left very specific instructions about international maritime routes. Seemed like he was fleeing something." Eduardo thanked him for the information and immediately passed it on to the detective, who contacted international maritime authorities. "He might be trying to reach international waters," the detective explained. "Once there, it becomes harder to extradite him." Hours passed in growing tension. Eduardo remained at the beach house, helping investigators catalog the evidence left behind. Each document revealed a new layer of Rodrigo's conspiracy. The detective's phone rang. It was the Coast Guard. "We located the yacht," he announced after hanging up. "He's 20 miles offshore, trying to reach international waters, but we have a complicated situation." "What situation?" Eduardo asked. "He's not alone. There are other people on the yacht, and we don't know if they're accomplices or hostages." Eduardo felt a chill down his spine. Rodrigo was dangerously escalating his escape, potentially putting innocent lives at risk. "Detective," Eduardo said, with determination. "I know Rodrigo better than anyone. Let me talk to him on the radio. Maybe I can prevent anyone from getting hurt." The proposal was risky, but the detective realized that Eduardo might be their best chance to resolve the situation peacefully. The Coast Guard vessel cut through the waves towards Rodrigo's yacht, with Eduardo on board, holding the radio firmly. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the emotion of confronting 15 years of friendship that had turned out to be an elaborate lie. "Rodrigo, this is Eduardo." His voice echoed through the marine radio. "We need to talk." There was a long silence before the familiar response came through the radio waves. "Eduardo, you should be dead." The coldness in Rodrigo's voice shocked everyone who heard it. "But I'm not, and you know why? A 7-year-old girl had more courage and honesty than a 45-year-old man." "Ah, the cleaning lady's daughter. I always knew that child was problematic, observing everything." Eduardo felt anger swell in his chest. "Problematic? She saved my life and exposed your betrayal." "Betrayal?" Rodrigo laughed bitterly. Eduardo, you never truly understood business. Always too sentimental, too concerned with employees and benefits. I transformed a mediocre company into something that could be grand. By stealing and lying? Doing what was necessary. You were satisfied with crumbs when we could have the whole world. The Coast Guard commander signaled to Eduardo that they were approaching the yacht. Through binoculars, they could see Rodrigo on deck, seemingly alone. Rodrigo, surrender now. You can still minimize the consequences. Minimize? Rodrigo's voice rose an octave. Eduardo, you ruined everything. I had years of planning, international contacts, a brilliant future. You had my trust. That was worth more than any money. There was another long silence. When Rodrigo spoke again, his voice was different, laden with deep bitterness. Your trust suffocated me, Eduardo. Always the kind Eduardo, the generous Eduardo, the Eduardo everyone admired. Do you know what it's like to live in someone's shadow? Eduardo felt a pang of understanding, but not sympathy. So our whole friendship was a lie? Not entirely, but in recent years, yes, I got tired of being second fiddle in the symphony of your life. The yacht had stopped, rocking gently on the waves. The Coast Guard approached cautiously, ready for any eventuality. Rodrigo, for God's sake, think of Marcia. She almost destroyed her own life because you exploited her desperation. Marcia made a choice. I just offered an opportunity. You manipulated a desperate mother. And you manipulated my loyalty for 15 years, making me believe we were equal partners when I was always just your well-paid subordinate. Eduardo realized there was no way to reach Rodrigo's heart. The resentment had rotted any goodness that might have existed between them. Last chance, Rodrigo. Surrender voluntarily. The response came in the form of action. Rodrigo suddenly accelerated the yacht, attempting one last desperate escape towards international waters. But the Coast Guard was prepared. Fast boats surrounded the yacht, blocking any escape route. In minutes, Rodrigo was cornered, his yacht's engine failing under the pressure of the pursuit. Eduardo watched through binoculars as his former best friend finally surrendered, his hands raised in defeat. He felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for what could have been. It's over, the Coast Guard commander murmured. But Eduardo knew that for him, the healing process was just beginning. 15 years of betrayed trust did not recover easily, but he had something Rodrigo never did, the ability to forgive and rebuild. He thought of Isabella and her innocent courage, of Brenda and her humble loyalty, and knew that there was still enough goodness in the world to compensate for the evil he had discovered. A week after Rodrigo's capture, the courthouse was packed for the preliminary hearing. Eduardo took his seat in the front row, alongside Brenda and Isabella, who had insisted on being present to see the bad man judged. The girl held her doll tightly, as if it were a talisman of courage. Marcia entered, escorted, but without handcuffs. Her lawyer had negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for her full testimony against Rodrigo. She looked at Eduardo with tears in her eyes, and he nodded discreetly, signaling forgiveness. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, this case represents one of the most elaborate corporate conspiracies we have ever seen. The defendant, Rodrigo, Maxwell, not only attempted to murder his partner, but also embezzled millions of dollars and psychologically manipulated a vulnerable employee. Rodrigo, wearing a plain suit instead of his usual expensive clothes, remained impassive beside his lawyer. His expression was that of someone who had accepted defeat, but without showing remorse. When it was Marcia's turn to testify, her voice trembled with emotion. My mother was dying, she began, and I had no money for the treatment. Mr. Maxwell approached me like a saving angel, offering hope when I had none. "And how did he convince you to poison Eduardo Sterling?" the prosecutor asked. "He said it would only be something to make Mr. Sterling sick for a few days so he could save the company from wrong decisions. He promised that no one would be truly harmed." Eduardo watched Marcia with genuine compassion. He could clearly see how desperation had made her vulnerable to Rodrigo's manipulation. "Do you believe today that Rodrigo intended only to make the victim sick?" Marcia looked directly at Rodrigo before answering. "No, based on the medical exams, if the girl hadn't seen me and alerted everyone, Mr. Sterling would have died." The next witness was Isabella. The judge had allowed her to testify, in a special manner considering her age. The girl approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who knew she was doing the right thing. "Isabella," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell the judge what you saw that morning?" "I saw the lady put a little white powder in Uncle Eduardo's coffee. She looked around to see if anyone was watching, but I was playing in the hallway and saw everything." "And are you sure it was the secretary?" "Yes, I am. She's the same lady who always wears nice clothes and sits at the big desk." The judge was impressed by the child's clarity and conviction. "Isabella, did you know that what you saw was dangerous?" "I knew it was wrong. My mommy always taught me not to put anything in other people's food or drink without them knowing." When it was Eduardo's turn to testify, he spoke not only about the poisoning, but about the 15 years of betrayed friendship. "Your Honor, what hurts me most is not the attempted murder, but discovering that someone I trusted like a brother was planning my destruction for so long." "Do you wish to make any specific request to the court?" the judge asked. Eduardo looked at Marcia, then at Rodrigo. "I ask that Marcia Davies receive an alternative sentence that allows her to care for her mother. She was as much a victim of manipulation as I was a victim of poisoning." A murmur of approval went through the courtroom. Eduardo's generosity impressed everyone present. Rodrigo, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally asked to speak. I didn't expect Eduardo to be so magnanimous," he said. In a hoarse voice, perhaps I destroyed the only true friendship I ever had." It was too late for regrets, but Eduardo saw a glimpse of the man he had known years ago in Rodrigo's broken words. 2 months after the sentencing, Sterling Corporation was being rebuilt under a new philosophy. Eduardo had implemented profound changes that transformed not only the corporate structure, but the entire organizational culture. The first change was the creation of the Isabella Employee Protection Program, a confidential system where any worker could report suspicious or concerning situations without fear of retaliation. The name had been suggested by the girl herself, who was moved to learn that her courage would help others. "Uncle Eduardo," Isabella said during a visit to the renovated office, "now other employees can be detectives too." "Exactly, little hero," Eduardo replied, smiling as he watched her observe the new facilities with curiosity. "Everyone can help protect each other." Brenda Miller had been promoted to supervisor of employee safety and well-being. Her life experience and ability to observe important details made her perfect for the role. She now occupied her own office, but maintained the humility that had always characterized her. "Mr. Sterling," she said during a meeting, "I received 3 reports this week about employees experiencing financial difficulties. Perhaps we could implement an emergency fund." "Excellent idea, Brenda. We cannot allow desperation to make our people vulnerable to manipulation again." Marcia's story had deeply touched Eduardo. She was serving her sentence in a community reintegration program, working during the day and caring for her mother at night. The medical treatment had been funded by a special fund established by Eduardo, who believed that justice should be accompanied by compassion. "How is your mother, Marcia?" Eduardo asked during one of his monthly visits to the reintegration center. "Improving, sir. The doctors say the treatment is effective," she replied, still unable to look him directly in the eyes. "I'll never be able to apologize enough for what I did." "Marcia, what matters is that you learned from your mistake and are helping others in similar situations within the program." It was true. Marcia had become a volunteer counselor for people in financial vulnerability, using her painful experience to prevent others from making similar mistakes. Rodrigo had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, corporate fraud, and multiple financial crimes. All the diverted funds were recovered and returned to the company. He served his sentence in silence, refusing visitors and demonstrating an isolation that reflected his own choice to destroy relationships. Eduardo had visited Rodrigo only once, 3 weeks after the sentencing. "Why did you come here?" Rodrigo asked without lifting his eyes. "Because 15 years of friendship cannot be completely erased, even after everything." "You're a fool, Eduardo, you always were." "Perhaps, but I'd rather be a trusting fool than a cunning betrayer." Rodrigo did not respond, but Eduardo saw silent tears rolling down his former friend's face. The office, where everything had begun now, had strict security protocols. No drinks or food were prepared without the presence of at least 2 people, and security cameras operated with redundant systems that prevented sabotage. But the most significant change was emotional. Eduardo had learned that true trust did not mean blindness, and that caring for the people around him was the best way to build genuine loyalty. "Mommy," Isabella said, while playing in the new recreational area created for employees' children, "Uncle Eduardo seems happier now, doesn't he?" Brenda smiled, watching Eduardo interact naturally with the employees. "Yes, my dear. Sometimes we need to go through storms to appreciate the sun." The company had not only survived the betrayal, but had become stronger and more humane. 1 year after that fateful Monday morning, Eduardo Sterling woke up with a different feeling. It was no longer the obsessive anxiety of business that drove him, but a deep satisfaction in knowing that he had transformed a personal tragedy into collective growth. The 40th floor office was being prepared for a special ceremony. Today, the Isabella Center for Employee Well-Being and Education would be officially inaugurated, a program that combined quality education for employees' children with training and observation and reporting dangerous situations. Uncle Eduardo Canar. "I helped prepare the coffee for the party." Isabella, now 8 years old and even more observant than before, asked. "Of course, little detective," Eduardo smiled, "but this time we'll prepare it together, where everyone can see." The ceremony gathered employees, their families, local authorities, and press representatives. Eduardo had decided to make the story of the conspiracy public, transforming it into an example of how individual courage can protect entire communities. Brenda, elegant in her new role, presented the results of the first year of the protection program. "We received 43 reports, identified 12 situations of vulnerability, and helped 27 families overcome financial difficulties before they became desperate." The applause was warm. Eduardo understood that he had created something much bigger than a company. He had built a genuine community. During the ceremony, a surprise moved everyone. Marcia arrived accompanied by her mother, who was visibly recovered. She had completed her sentence and been accepted into the company's own reintegration program. "Mr. Sterling," Marcia said with a firm voice, "I would like to speak to everyone present, if you'll allow me." Eduardo nodded, curious about what she would say. "A year ago, I almost made the worst mistake of my life," Marcia began, her voice echoing through the silent auditorium. "Desperation made me vulnerable to manipulation, and I almost destroyed The life of a good man by believing the lies of a bad one. She looked directly at Isabella, but a courageous little girl taught me that there are always choices. Even in the most difficult moments, I chose cowardice then, but today I choose the courage to tell my story so that others do not make the same mistake. The applause was even more intense. Eduardo felt tears in his eyes as he saw how forgiveness had transformed into true redemption. The most moving part of the ceremony was when Isabella, now a scholarship student at one of the city's best schools, presented her special project, an illustrated guide teaching other children how to identify dangerous situations and whom to approach. Sometimes adults don't see things that children see, she explained with the precocious wisdom that characterized her. But together, adults and children can protect everyone. Eduardo approached the microphone for the final words of the ceremony. "A year ago, a cup of coffee almost cost me my life," he began. "Today, we prepare coffee together, transparently, as a symbol that true security comes from mutual trust and collective care." He raised his cup, the same white porcelain one that had been broken on the day of the poisoning, now carefully restored with golden veins. A Japanese technique called kintsugi, which repairs broken pottery with gold lacquer, making the cracks part of the object's beauty and strength. This coffee represents our journey. We were broken, but we became stronger and more beautiful in the places where we healed. Everyone raised their cups in a silent toast to overcoming courage and hope. Eduardo looked around, seeing smiling faces where before there had only been anonymous employees. Brenda supervised everything with maternal pride, Isabella distributed her drawings to other children, and Marcia helped serve coffee with a tranquility she hadn't possessed in years. The businessman understood that he had discovered something more valuable than any fortune, a community united by true trust, protected by the loving vigilance of everyone for everyone, and strengthened by the ability to transform pain into growth. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest betrayals lead to the greatest transformations, and sometimes the smallest voice is the one that echoes strongest in defense of justice.